So this is our very final module of in exploring a big world in a small package, like in biology, identification, and conservation. So I just want to wrap up with some takeaway messages and then also just share a fun little story of traveling the world with lichens, sort of a very spread out virtual field trip. So I just wanted to share the two word clouds that we made as a group. And it's really fun to see the changes. And it's also really fun to see all of you came to this workshop with a lot of knowledge of lichens already. You know, some of the largest terms in that first word cloud are fungi, algae, and symbiosis, which are the three words you should think of when you think of lichens. So that is so great. And then a lot about how they look and where you might find them. And then we get into more complexity, literally the word complex, lichens as habitat, lichens as indicators, their role in sequestration, the fact that they're everywhere. So it's fun to be able to see that, our journey together through this very brief and intensive introduction to lichens. So thank you for exploring that with me. So I just wanted to share at the end here a little bit about my own experience as a lichenologist. And, you know, I referred to that Ed Yong quote about lichens are the overlooked organisms that keep challenging our assumptions about life as basically the reason why I keep studying lichens. They're so intriguing. They're so fun. There's such depth to what they even are, what they're doing. And there's also just a lot of fun to be had as a lichenologist. I have had the tremendous and very privileged opportunity to travel to a lot of different places to study lichens. And these are just a few of them. But these are different places I got to travel for my dissertation work, looking at the latitudinal diversity gradient of lichens. So that's asking the question, are there more species of lichens? And again, referring to the lichenized fungi in the tropics around the equator or outside of the tropics as you go towards the poles. And this is a pattern that has been observed in a lot of different groups of organisms. So flowering plants, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians all follow this latitudinal diversity gradient, where the peak of diversity is in the tropics. Turns out, at least based upon the data that we have, that is true for lichens too. And it's a bit of a surprise. And I even went into the project thinking that they might be an exception to the rule because of that whole Arctic tundra covered in lichens. But it turns out that as you go towards the tropics, there's just that many more lichen species. So they're hardy, they can be found in a lot of places, but the high diversity seems to be in places that support high diversity. So not too surprising there. So yeah, so I've gotten to go to very remote places in the boreal forest in northern Canada, all the way down to the Peruvian Amazon, where I heard sounds of animals at night that I couldn't even identify what kind of animal it was coming from, and a whole bunch of places in between. So it's been a wonderful experience so far, and definitely something that I'm excited to continue because lichens are everywhere. So there's opportunities to learn a lot about them everywhere, from the deck in your own backyard to the Amazon rainforest. So I just want to introduce you to some other lichens. So I introduced you to like some suburban and urban lichens in a previous module, but now let's bounce around to different parts of the world and get to know some other lichens that I think are really cool. This is Herbaphthalon rubricinctum, the Christmas lichen, because it is green and red. Sometimes it can be white and red, but that does not mean that it has bleached. So, you know, again, it just takes a trained eye and just looking at a lot of lichens to know about that. This is a really fun one because it is a crustose. I would call it a crustose species, but it's one of those sort of in-between species because it's very tightly pressed against the substrate, but it's actually fluffy. There's no better term for it. It's fluffy, and so it's a really fun one to encounter. This grows mostly in the tropics and subtropics. So herpethalin, that's where you would encounter it. And it's just really distinctive when you do. It's epiphytic. It grows on the bark of trees. And part of its fluffy nature is it's hydrophobic. So, you know, in a place like the lowland tropics, this thing's going to be inundated with precipitation every day. And even though it wants some moisture, to get that much would drown it out. And so it actually has a hydrophobic quality. So if you were to like spray water at this, it would bead on the surface. And so that's a really cool adaptation of this particular lichen. It's also, to my observation, an early colonizer in forest gaps. So even though you can see it throughout a tropical forest, you'll see a lot of it in, you know, a recent tree fall or something like that. The trees around the edges will be colonized by this. So that's just another fun fact about Herpethalin rubrosynctum. Acrospora fuscata, this is a very zoomed in image. You could easily pass this by many, many times because it just looks like teeny tiny brown squares on the surface of a rock, and the rock is usually brownish gray, and so it can be totally camouflaged. This is the brown cobblestone lichen. It's a crustose lichen, saxicolous, meaning it grows on rocks, and it's quite widespread from both low to high elevations in North America and Europe, and probably other places too, but that's where we have most of the records for it. And like I said, it's cryptic, but very fun to find, especially if you have a hand lens to get a nice close look at it. Leptogium cordicola. The common name of this is the blistered jelly skin, which is just a fantastic name. And this is a foliose jelly lichen. So that's kind of a growth form or growth habit that I didn't discuss, and is pretty unique to lichens that contain cyanobacteria as their primary photobiont. So we call those cyanolichens. In this case, the cyanobacterial photobiont is nostoc, but like I said, there are other cyanobacteria that can be photobionts as well. This grows on wood or sometimes on mossy rocks. And this is another case where it looks completely different, dry versus wet. So when it's dry, it's very thin and almost papery looking and is very pale slate gray. And then when it's wet, it gets this more jelly-like consistency and turns this dark green black like you see in the photograph. So I really wanted to make sure that you got to see a cyanolichen, because there certainly are cyanolichens out there, and so this is one of them. This particular species, I'm not entirely sure of its distribution. I've encountered a lot of cyanolichens in the tropics, but you can certainly encounter them in other places as well. Here in California, I've encountered a lot of them in North Carolina as well, and probably many other places in between. They tend to prefer more shaded environments, but that's not a universal variable. So just keep an eye out for them everywhere. And I think last but not least, this is Usnea aurantiacoatra. And as far as I know, but maybe I should have asked some people who actually study this, there's no common name. This has a southern polar distribution and is able to survive in Antarctica, specifically on the Antarctic Peninsula, not interior Antarctica. It's a fruticose species, it's Usnea, and I just really wanted to include this because it looks to me like something from another world. It forms these crazy pom-poms of these twisted branches, and it's actually this yellowish color with these dark black apothecia and these funny little black branchlets. And so just a really wild individual that I wanted to introduce you to. And also, like most Usneas, it has a central cord, but it has a very strong central cord. I was trying to actually just cut up some of this the other day to do some extractions, and it was very challenging. So a very strong central cord there. So that was just a really quick, we went, tropics and Antarctica and all over to introduce you to just a few more lichens, but of course there's so many more for you to get to know. So hopefully you'll be able to take advantage of those resources that we've shared with you, and maybe some future workshops too. But just to wrap up today's workshop, here's what I think of as the take-home messages, but I'm sure, or I hope that you've taken some other stuff away as well. But lichenized fungi are a polyphyletic and successful group that have colonized every terrestrial habitat. Lichens may be tiny, but they add up to have a mighty impact through their roles in global water, carbon, and nutrient cycles. Lichens have very unique features in terms of the substrate they grow on, their different growth forms and reproductive structures and color, and all of those things can be used to identify them in the field. And studying lichens, hopefully you've gotten this idea, can lead to incredible adventures. So grab your hand lens and go forth. And thank you so much for joining me for this workshop today. And I do believe I've left us some time for questions, so I'll happily try to catch up on those now.